In this video, we're going to start looking at counting. And so as we look at counting, we are going to talk about counting via systematic listing. So we're just going to go through a whole lot of examples of how we might list these things systematically. And so our first example is, consider a group of students. We have Ross, Phoebe, Rachel, Joey, Monica, and Chandler. Phoebe, Rachel, and Monica are female, while Ross, Joey, and Chandler are male. We want to list the following ways of forming a group where there is a president and a treasurer if the president and treasurer are not the same gender. Right? So when we list these, we'll list them by the letter of their first names. The first letter that's listed will be the president, and then the second would be the treasurer. And so we could have Ross as president, and since they have to be different genders, we could have Ross and Phoebe. We could have Ross and Rachel have the same first letter. Ross and Rachel, or Ross and Monica. So those are all the ways that Ross could be the president. We could have Phoebe as president. If Phoebe is president, then we would need a male treasurer. And so it could be Phoebe and Ross, Phoebe and Joey, or Phoebe and Chandler. If Rachel is president, then Ross could be the vice president, or Joey, or Chandler. If Joey is president, then we could have Phoebe, or Joey and Rachel, or Joey and Monica. If Monica is president, we could have Ross, or Monica and Joey, or Monica and Chandler. And if Chandler is president, it could be Phoebe as treasurer, Rachel as treasurer, or Monica. And when we look at those and we count those up, the total number of ways we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. 18 different ways that we could choose a president and a treasurer if they are not of the same gender. If instead of choosing just a president and treasurer, if we're choosing a president, secretary, and treasurer, right? So now we're choosing 3 people. The president and treasurer will both be female, while the secretary has no restriction. Then if we go through this, we could have so we'll go president, secretary, treasurer. So as president, we could have Monica as president, and then we could have Ross, and then Rachel, or Monica, Ross, and Phoebe. Or we could have Monica, Rachel, and Phoebe. And Phoebe, I don't need to put that comma before Phoebe. Or we could have Monica, Joey, and Rachel. Or Monica, Joey, and Phoebe. We could have Monica, Phoebe, and then Rachel. We could have Monica, Chandler, and Rachel. Or Monica, Chandler, and Phoebe. So those are all the different ways we could have Monica as president, to have Phoebe as president. We could have Phoebe, Ross, Rachel, or we could have Phoebe, Ross, Monica. We could have Phoebe, Rachel, Monica, or Phoebe, Monica, Rachel. We could have Phoebe, Joey, Monica, or Phoebe, Joey, Rachel. We could have Phoebe, Chandler, Monica, or Phoebe, Chandler, Rachel. Let's see. There we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep. And we can also do the same thing with Rachel. So if Rachel was president, we could have Rachel and then Ross and Phoebe, or Rachel, Ross, Monica. We could have Rachel, Phoebe, Monica, or change the order of Phoebe and Monica positions so that Monica's secretary and Phoebe's treasurer. We could have Rachel, Joey, Phoebe, or Rachel, Joey, not Chandler, Monica. Because we are told the treasurer needs to be female, and so Chandler is not an option there. We have Rachel, Chandler, Phoebe, or Rachel, Chandler, Monica. And in total, so we had 8 ways for Monica to be president, 8 ways for Phoebe to be president, 8 ways for Rachel to be president. So in total, there are 24 different ways that we could choose those. If we're looking for a committee of 2 people, for a committee, the order in which those 2 people doesn't actually matter, so you just care what 2 people are on that committee. And so we could have, all right, so let's try to go through this systematically. So Ross is the first name in this list up here. So let's write all the committees that can have Ross. So we can have Ross and Phoebe. We can have Ross and Rachel. We could have Ross and Joey, or Ross and Monica, or Ross and Chandler. So those are all the committees that have Ross. Again, the order doesn't matter, so it doesn't matter if I put Ross first or second. That's the same committee of 2. If we have Phoebe, we can have Phoebe. We've already talked about Phoebe and Ross, so we don't need to count it a second time. So we could have Phoebe and Rachel. We could have Phoebe and Joey, Phoebe and Monica, and Phoebe and Chandler. So now we've listed all the committees that have Phoebe as part of it. If we look now at Rachel, the committees involving Rachel, we have Rachel. We've already described Rachel and Ross being on a committee, and Rachel and Phoebe being on a committee together. And so we have Rachel and Joey, Rachel and Monica, Rachel and Chandler. Next we will move on to committees with Joey. We have Joey and Monica, Joey and Chandler, and committees with Monica. We have Monica and Chandler. All the other committees with Monica have already been counted. All of the committees with Chandler have already been listed. And so if we count those, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 different committees that we can make. All right. So that is how we might use systematic listing. In our next video, we will look at creating a tree diagram to try to write out all of our listings. We will see you then.